Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a particular kind of silence that falls over the galaxy when the Tyranids are coming. It is not an absence of noise exactly. It is something far more personal than that. Astropaths, those poor, blinded souls who spend their lives screaming psychic messages across the void, begin to lose their words. Their voices dissolve into a hiss of white noise, like trying to tune in a signal through a storm that never breaks. Navigators, the mutant pilots who steer starships through the raw chaos of the warp, find themselves unable to see their own hands in the psychic dark. Their third eye, the organ that lets them perceive the impossible currents of the Imperium, is simply swamped, overwhelmed, blinded by something so vast and so utterly alien that the human mind cannot process it without breaking. Planets go quiet, systems fall silent, and then the sky above those worlds changes. Not dramatically at first, but slowly. The stars at the edges of vision begin to disappear, one by one, blotted out by something enormous and organic and utterly without mercy. The children of those worlds look up and see the darkness between the stars begin to move, and they understand. In the last moments they have left to understand anything, what is about to happen to them. This is what the coming of a Hive fleet feels like. This is the Tyranids. Now, most of you watching this channel know the broad strokes of the Great Devourer. You know about the Hive mind, that impossible Gestalt consciousness composed of billions and billions of individual organisms, all screaming in psychic unison. You know about Hive Fleet Behemoth crashing into the Ultramarines at Macragh in 745 EMS41, and the titanic struggle that left an entire chapter devastated, but the fleet broken. You know about Kraken's splintering assault across the Eastern Fringe less than 250 years later, devouring worlds at a terrifying rate. You know about Leviathan rising from below the galactic plane in 997.M41. The largest incursion ever recorded, striking from a direction no one expected. But today we are going somewhere different. Today we are going somewhere that should be impossible. Today we are going inside the Webway, the labyrinthine dimension, the ancient network of tunnels carved into the space between real space and the warp, by being so old and so advanced that the Aeldari, who have lived for thousands of years each, think of them as mythological. The Webway is the most sacred, most carefully guarded infrastructure in the galaxy. It has stood for millions of years. It survived the war in heaven. It survived the fall of the Eldar, when a new god was born, and the screaming death of a civilization tore apart great swathes of its corridors. It survived demons, Necron intrusions, the Emperor's own catastrophic attempt to build a human branch of it beneath Terra. And the Tyranids got inside it anyway. Not just a scout organism slipping through a cracked gate. Not just a stray genestealer stumbling into a portal it did not understand. We are talking about a full-scale Tyranid incursion into the Webway itself. Swarms pouring through compromised nexus points. The Hive mind turning its incomprehensible attention toward a dimension it should never have been able to perceive, let alone reach. What did it find in there? What happens when the most voracious biological predator in all of recorded history enters a dimension constructed from psychic energy, a dimension home to one of the most ancient and populated cities in the galaxy, a dimension that connects to the secret library containing every piece of forbidden knowledge the Aeldari have ever recorded? We are going to find out, every step of it. We are going to trace how the Tyranids arrived, what they encountered, how the Aeldari responded, what the Great Devourer learned, what it absorbed, and what it might do with that knowledge going forward. But to understand all of that, we first have to understand what the Webway actually is. Because it is not simply a tunnel, it is not simply a highway. The Webway is something far stranger and more dangerous than most races in the galaxy realize. And the fact that the Tyranids breached it should terrify everyone. So settle in, get comfortable, because we are about to go somewhere quiet and glowing and incredibly old, and something with a billion teeth is going to follow us in. Section 2. What the Webway is. A dimension between worlds. Let me try to describe something that defies description. You are standing at the edge of the universe you know. On one side is real space, the material universe, with its stars and planets and the cold, vast distances between them. On the other side, pressing against the skin of reality like something beneath a thin membrane, is the warp, the immaterium, the realm of pure psychic energy where the emotions of every living creature coalesce into a roiling, impossible storm populated by things that want to consume you. Between those two dimensions, nestled in the space between them, like a pocket sewn into the lining of a coat, is the Webway. The Webway is a hyperdimensional construct. It is not truly part of real space, and it is not truly part of the warp. It exists in the interstice between them, a liminal realm created by psychic engineering so advanced that the Aeldari of the 41st Millennium, who inherited it, do not fully understand how it was built. Its corridors glow with a faint, sourceless light. Its walls are formed from wraithbone and materials that have no equivalent in real space, substances psychically resistant to the tides of the immaterium. These materials are what keep the warp out. They are the locks on the doors. Inside, the geometry defies the physics of the material universe. A section of Webway corridor can be kilometers long in one dimension, and a single step from end to end in another. Distances do not behave the way they should. A traveler can step into a Webway gate on one side of the galaxy and emerge on the other in what feels like minutes, because time within the Webway moves differently depending on where you are and how you are moving through it. Some sections are known to elder scholars as places where time flows backwards. Other sections are called the crossroads of inertia, where time does not flow at all. Inquisitor Bronislaw Chevak once spent decades wandering the Webway and emerged several centuries younger than when he entered. The scale of the thing is almost impossible to hold in the mind. At the height of the Aeldari Empire, and we are talking about tens of thousands of years ago, when the Aeldari were the undisputed masters of the galaxy, the Webway connected hundreds of thousands of worlds. It was the arterial system of a galactic civilization, the roads along which everything traveled: armies, merchants, diplomats, scholars, pilgrims. Every Aeldari world of significance had at least one Webway gate. Some had dozens. The craft worlds themselves were designed to dock at major Webway junctions, great spheres of swirling light and darkness held like pearls in their hulls. And at the heart of this system, the great hub through which so much of the network ran, sat Commorragh. You likely know Commorragh, or at least know of it. The Dark City, the home of the Drukhari, the Dark Eldar. Those unspeakably cruel remnants of the old Aeldari Empire, who retreated into the Webway when the fall came, and have been living there, feeding on the suffering of others, ever since. Commorragh is not a small settlement. It is not a city in any sense that makes sense when you look at it from outside. It is, by almost any metric, the largest inhabited settlement in the galaxy. It is composed of thousands of subrealms and pocket dimensions stitched together by portals, each district the size of a world, all of it floating within the Webway's impossible geography, like a cancerous growth, eating the arteries it depends on to survive. The city is lit by stolen suns. That is not a metaphor. The Drukhari physically removed stars from real space, ancient dying stars, it is true, but still genuine stellar objects, and transported them into Webway sub-realms to provide their city with light and power. When you look up in Commorragh, you see the light of suns that no longer exist in the universe you were born in, and deeper still, further into the most protected and concealed corridors of the Webway, hidden behind riddles and illusions and traps so lethal that armies have been destroyed trying to find it, is the Black Library. This is the most important collection of knowledge in the galaxy, if not the entire universe as understood by the races within it. The Harlequins, the servants of the laughing god Shegarach, guard it. Everything the Aeldari have ever learned about chaos, about the nature of the warp, about the threats that exist beyond the galaxy and within it. Everything they have recorded about their own vast history and the deeper history of the universe they inherited from the Old Ones. All of it is there. In texts and data crystals and living artworks and forms of information storage that have no equivalent in any other culture. Now you might wonder, who built all of this? Who built the Webway in the first place? The answer is the Old Ones. And if you do not know about the Old Ones, the shortest version is this. They were the most advanced civilization in the history of the galaxy. They arose before the Aeldari, before humanity, before the Necron. They were so old and so powerful that their relationship to the younger species was closer to gods than to neighbors. They created the Webway as a navigational tool, a way to traverse the galaxy without risking the warp, which even then was a dangerous place. They carved its corridors from dimensions that the younger races could not perceive, and locked it with psychic wards that should have been impenetrable. They also created, either intentionally or as a consequence of their experiments, most of the younger intelligent races of the galaxy. Current evidence and Aeldari myth both suggest the Old Ones had a hand in the development of the Elder themselves. And more controversially, there are theories, we will return to them, that suggest the Tyranids may have some connection to the Old Ones as well. The Old Ones are gone now. They were broken by the war in heaven, the ancient conflict between themselves and the Necrons, who had been given the power of the Citan, the star gods, to use as weapons. In the closing stages of that war, the Old Ones' creations ran out of control. The warp was destabilized catastrophically, and the Old Ones simply ceased to be, vanishing or dying, their ultimate fate unknown. What they left behind was the Webway, functioning but unguided, slowly being learned and expanded by the Aeldari who had inherited it. After the Old Ones departed, the Aeldari became the Webway's new masters. They learned its paths, mapped its corridors, built new branches, and over tens of thousands of years created the greatest transportation network in galactic history. For a long time, they were its sole tenants. The Webway was theirs in a way that nothing else in the galaxy quite was. A gift from their creators, a heritage that set them apart from every other living race. Then the fall happened. The birth of Slaanesh, she who thirsts, the fourth chaos god, the god of excess and sensation and pain and ecstasy, tore a wound in reality at the center of the Aeldari Empire that sent shockwaves through every dimension connected to it. The warp exploded. The Eye of Terror opened, swallowing 1,000 Aeldari worlds, and the Webway shattered. Not entirely, not completely, but enormous stretches of it were ruptured, corridors opening into the warp and becoming impassable, flooded with demons and raw immaterium energy. Entire sections became dead ends, others collapsed entirely, and the knowledge of the Webway's full layout, all the maps and navigation guides that had been stored in libraries and data archives on worlds now consumed by the Eye of Terror, was simply gone. The Aeldari who survived the fall were left with a Webway that still worked, still connected them to each other and to the remains of their civilization, but which was now far smaller, far more damaged, and far more dangerous than it had ever been before. Pockets of it were infested with demons. Other sections had simply ceased to follow the laws of physics in any coherent way, and nobody had a complete map anymore. This is the Webway at the time the Tyranids arrive, ancient, vast, partially ruined, defended fiercely by the Aeldari, who rely on it for survival, and by the Harlequins who walk its paths as their permanent home, and by the Drukhari who have built their entire civilization inside it. And into this, the Great Devourer comes. Section 3. The Tyranids. Hunger without limit. Before we talk about what the Tyranids found in the Webway, we need to establish exactly what the Tyranids are, because they are unlike anything else in the setting, not just in terms of their biology or their numbers, but in terms of what they fundamentally represent in the 40k universe. Understanding what makes them unique is what makes what happened in the Webway so deeply unsettling. The Tyranids are extragalactic. They are not from our galaxy. They came from somewhere in the intergalactic void, possibly from Andromeda, though this has never been confirmed. And they have been traveling the darkness between galaxies for an indeterminate amount of time. Some theories suggest they have consumed entire other galaxies before turning their attention to the Milky Way. The Codex of the third edition speculated that they may have annihilated over 1,000 galaxies and been responsible for the extinction of millions of intelligent species. Whether that number is accurate or poetic exaggeration in the style of 40k's in-universe documentation, the point is clear. The Tyranids are not a threat that arose from within the galaxy we know. They are something that arrived from outside it, with all the ecological violence of an invasive species encountering a biosphere it evolved nowhere near. They do not use the warp for travel. This is crucial, and it sets them apart from every other major faction in the setting. The Imperium, Chaos, the Aeldari, the Tau, all of them interact with the warp in some way. The Imperium travels through it, psychically navigating its currents with the guidance of the Emperor's Astronomicon beacon and the mutant navigators who can perceive it. The Aeldari use the Webway to avoid it. The Chaos gods live inside it, but the Tyranids simply do not use it. Instead, they travel through real space directly, using a small organism called the Navhal. The Navhal is essentially a living gravity engine. It detects and locks onto the gravitational signature of distant star systems and uses this information to fold space around the fleet, compressing vast distances and allowing the Tyranids to travel at speeds far exceeding light without ever entering the warp at all. It is slower than warp travel in absolute terms, particularly when approaching a system with strong local gravity, but it is far more reliable. And it means the Tyranids are not dependent on any psychic infrastructure that could be disrupted or destroyed. The reason this matters for our story is that the Tyranids also, by default, have no presence in the warp in the conventional sense. Individual Tyranid organisms have no souls, or if they have something equivalent, it is so alien that demons and warp predators do not recognize it as something worth consuming. When a human dies, their soul enters the warp and becomes vulnerable to the entities that live there. When a Tyranid organism dies, it simply stops. There is nothing for Slanesh to feed on. There is nothing for a demon to claim. In the theological framework of 40k, this makes the Tyranids spiritually invisible in a way that is actually quite eerie. This does not mean the Tyranids have no connection to the warp at all. The Hive mind, the Gestalt consciousness that links every individual Tyranid organism into a single vast intelligence, does have a psychic presence, and it is enormous. The Hive mind is the collective psychic voice of billions and billions of living creatures, all screaming together in a chorus of pure biological hunger. And the resonance of that voice in the warp is what creates what is known as the shadow in the warp. But we will get to that in a moment. First, a word about how the Tyranids came to be in our galaxy at all. During the Horus Heresy, in roughly the year 008.M31, a desperate battle was fought on the world of Sotha. The Ultramarines had discovered a Necron device buried beneath a mountain there, a device called the Pharos. The Pharos was an ancient quantum empathic resonance beacon, essentially a psychic lighthouse that could be used to send navigational signals across vast distances through real space without using the warp. In the chaos of the Ruin Storm, which had severed most conventional travel and communication within the Imperium Secundus, the Pharos became desperately important. Night Lords attacked Sotha to claim it, and in the resulting battle, the defenders were forced to overload the Pharos to deny it to the traitors. The device sent out a massive psychic burst, a scream of empathic energy so powerful it propagated not just across the galaxy, but beyond it, out into the intergalactic void. Out in that void, somewhere in the lightless space between galaxies, the Tyranid Hive fleets were drifting. Whether they were in a state of hibernation, or simply moving slowly without a target, or had been travelling through the void for so long that their speed had dropped to something close to nothing, we do not know exactly. What we know is that the burst of empathic energy from the overloaded Pharos reached them. It reached them the way a lighthouse reaches a ship in fog. And the Hive mind that incomprehensibly vast and hungry intelligence, turned its attention toward the direction the signal had come from, toward the galaxy that had sent it, toward all that biological richness, all those trillions of living organisms, all that beautiful, consumable biomass. The fleet changed course toward the Milky Way. It took nearly 10,000 years for the main body of the fleet to arrive. They first reached the eastern fringe of the galaxy in 745.M41 as Hive Fleet Behemoth, and the galaxy had no idea what it was facing. Not really. The Imperium had encountered Genestealers before, but had no idea they were the vanguard of something so much larger. When Behemoth crashed into the defenses of Makraj, the homeworld of the Ultramarines, the sheer scale of the invasion was staggering. The Battle of Makraj became one of the most iconic engagements in the history of the Imperium, the First Tyrannic War, and the warning shot that told the rest of the galaxy something unimaginable was on its way. But Behemoth was only the beginning. Each Hive fleet that followed learned from the ones before it. Kraken, arriving in 993. M41 did not crash against defenses in a single concentrated assault. Instead, it split, fragmenting into countless tendrils that each moved independently, enveloping systems before reinforcements could arrive, spreading too fast and across too wide a front for any unified response. Leviathan, in 997.M41, went further still, attacking from below the galactic plane, from a direction no threat had ever come from, and doing so with a multi-vector approach that stretched the Imperium's strategic response to the point of near-total failure. Each fleet is also literally consuming the lessons of the last. When a Hive fleet absorbs the biomass of a world, the genetic information of every species on that world is processed, catalogued, and used to build new and more effective bioforms. A Hive fleet that has devoured worlds defended by space marines will spawn organisms whose chitin is thicker and whose claws are designed to pierce ceramite. A fleet that has fought Tau will adapt to counter pulse weaponry and smart missile systems. The Great Devourer is not just an apex predator. It is an apex predator that becomes specifically adapted to defeat you, personally, using the remains of your dead. And this is where we need to talk about what happens when the Tyranids have consumed Aeldari. Because the Aeldari are among the most psychically gifted species in the galaxy. Their souls burn brightly in the warp, which is exactly why Slaanesh hungers for them so terribly. Their psychic potential is woven into their genetics at a fundamental level, and when the hive mind absorbs Aeldari genetic material, as it did during the destruction of the craft world Iyanden by Hive Fleet Kraken, the results are immediately visible and immediately terrifying. The Zoanthrope, the Tyranids' most powerful line of psychic artillery, became significantly more capable after the Kraken's assault on Iyanden. It had already been speculated that zoanthropes were originally derived from ancient Eldar genetic material. The floating, over-craniumed, atrophied-bodied horrors bear a disturbing resemblance to psychic architecture that the Eldar would recognize. But after Iyanden, after thousands of Aeldari warriors and civilians had been broken down and fed into the Norn Queen's birthing pools, the zoanthropes that the hive mind produced were something new. Their psychic power had grown. Their ability to channel and focus the hive mind's will had improved. The galaxy had just taught the Tyranids how to be better at being psychic by dying and being eaten. And now we need to talk about how the Tyranids interact with the thing that psychic beings in this galaxy depend on most. Section 4. The Shadow in the Warp. A psychic extinction event. The Shadow in the Warp is one of those pieces of Warhammer 40k lore that sounds understated when you first encounter it and becomes genuinely horrifying the more you think about it. Here is the basic version. When a Tyranid hive fleet approaches a star system, it creates a zone of psychic interference. Astropathic communication becomes impossible. Warp travel in the vicinity becomes unreliable. Psykers within the affected area begin to suffer. And the closer the fleet gets, the worse these effects become. That is the basic version. The reality is considerably more disturbing. The Shadow in the Warp is not simply interference. It is not static, the way radiostatic is static. It is the psychic presence of an intelligence of almost incomprehensible scale, pushing its way into the perceptual space of anyone with the ability to sense the warp. It is the hive mind, the combined consciousness of billions of individual organisms, pressing its face against the window of the psychic realm and breathing on the glass. Every psyker within range does not simply lose their ability to communicate, they can hear it. They hear the hive mind in the hiss and scratch of their own thoughts, in the space between their own consciousness and the universe around them, in a register that cannot be ignored and cannot be blocked out by willpower alone. For ordinary psychers, this manifests as headaches, involuntary screaming, bleeding eyes, and eventually unconsciousness. Astropaths, whose minds are specifically tuned to the warp for the purpose of communication, suffer worst of all. There are records in the archives of the Adeptus Mechanicus of astropaths, driving their ships into planetary surfaces while under the influence of the shadow, of navigators smashing their heads against bulkheads trying to silence the sound, of sanctioned psychers burning out their own eyes in an attempt to end their perception of what their minds were being forced to experience. For the highly psychic Aeldari, the effect is magnified tenfold and beyond. The Aeldari experience emotions and psychic sensation at an intensity that no human can match. They're farseers, they're warlocks, they're psychers of every discipline. They feel the shadow the way you might feel a fire press against your bare skin. It does not simply interfere with their abilities, it causes physical pain. It strips away the elegant psychic senses they depend on for everything from battlefield awareness to basic communication, and replaces those senses with nothing but the cold, alien screaming of the hive mind. Now, here is why this matters for the Webway. The Webway's walls are psychically resistant. The corridors of the labyrinth dimension were built by the old ones specifically to insulate their interior from the chaos of the warp, to create a space where psychic creatures could travel without the constant assault of the Imperium bearing down on them. This resistance was what made the Webway safe for the Aeldari, whose souls were always at risk from Slayanesh. The wraithbone and psycho-conductive materials that form the Webway's structure create a boundary that warp energy cannot easily penetrate. But the shadow in the warp is not coming from the warp. It is not a demonic intrusion. It is not chaos energy bleeding through a crack in the psychic wall. It is a psychic effect emanating from the material universe, from the hive fleet itself, from the organisms in real space whose combined presence simply overwhelms nearby psychic architecture. This is the crucial question that no Aeldari Farseer had ever had to answer before the Tyranids arrived. Does the Webway protect against something coming from the outside in, or only from something coming from the inside out? The partial answer, terrifyingly, appears to be the latter. The Webway was built to keep the warp out. It was not built to keep the shadow in the warp out. And as we will see when we reach the actual events at Iyanden and Duriel, the shadow's interference with the Aeldari's psychic functions became a serious problem, even inside the Webway's corridors, when a hive fleet was close enough. But the shadow in the warp has another implication that we need to sit with for a moment, because it ties directly to what the Tyranids eventually found when they got inside. The Webway is not empty. It never was. It contains ruins of ancient Aeldari cities, abandoned for millennia after the fall. It contains the populated corridors of Komarach, where millions of Drukhari live and scheme and hunt. It contains the Black Library, guarded by harlequins whose entire existence is dedicated to preventing unauthorized access. And crucially, it contains the souls of the dead. Not literally. The Aeldari do not typically die in the Webway and have their souls linger there. But the spirit stones, the waystones, the infinity circuits of the craft worlds, all of these depend on psychic pathways that run through the Webway. The souls of dead Aeldari stored in spirit stones, waiting to be called up for battle in Wraithguard shells, or simply to rest in the peace of the infinity circuit, are bound to a psychic infrastructure that connects to and through the Webway. What happens when the shadow in the warp rolls over that infrastructure? What happens when the psychic equivalent of a continent-wide electrical storm passes through the circuits in which the dead are sleeping? We will return to that question. For now, we need to watch the disaster unfold in real time, because the first great Tyranid encounter with the Webway does not happen gradually or theoretically. It happens all at once, in fire and bone and the screaming of the dead, on a craft world called Iyanden. Section 5. The first contact, Kraken, reaches Iyanden. Let me tell you about Iyanden before the Great Devourer came for it, because it is important to understand what was lost. Iyanden was, at the height of its power, one of the most populous craft world Aeldari communities in the galaxy. It was vast. The craft world itself, a city-sized vessel drifting through deep space, was home to hundreds of thousands of Aeldari at its peak. Its infinity circuit, the repository of its dead, held the souls of countless generations of warriors and scholars and artists and seers, all carefully preserved in the crackling psychic architecture of wraithbone circuitry, waiting in what is hopefully something like peace until the craft world needed their service again. Iyanden's culture was, at its core, a culture of memory, the craft world's spirit seers, a particular kind of Aeldari seer, whose specialty was communing with the dead, were among the most skilled in the galaxy. The bond between the living and the dead on Iyanden was not merely philosophical or religious, it was intensely practical. When a crisis arose, the Wraithguard and Wraithlords and other ghost warriors, the mechanical bodies animated by the souls of the dead, were called up and fought alongside the living. The dead of Iyanden had saved it before. Nothing could have prepared them for what Hive Fleet Kraken was about to do. The first warning came from Iyanden's rangers, those wandering scouts who travelled far ahead of the craft world and fed intelligence back to its seers. In 992 Bafkon 41, they brought news that shook the craft world's council of seers to its core. An immense Tyranid fleet was bearing down on Iyanden's position. Not a splinter fleet, not a minor tendril, a full primary arm of Hive Fleet Kraken, comprising bioships by the tens of thousands, all vectored directly toward the craft world. Farseer Kelman, who led Iyanden's council at the time, had been warned. Eldrad Ulthran, the legendary Farseer of Ulthware, had sent word months earlier that a great threat was coming, but the council was divided. The more conservative members argued for isolationism, retreat, hide behind psychic barriers, hope the fleet passed. The more aggressive voices called for immediate deployment of the fleet to meet Kraken head-on. Both positions, as it turned out, underestimated the scale of what was coming. The Ranger Irilith's report eventually forced the council to accept the truth. The fleet was too large to hide from, and too vast for Iyanden's forces alone to defeat. They called for help. They sent messages through the Webway to other craft worlds. The shadow in the warp was already beginning to settle over the region like a fog, making psychic communication increasingly difficult. But some messages got through. Bieltan sent what forces it could. Harlequins arrived through the Webway. A few Exodite warriors came through Webway portals. But the distances involved, and the disruption to Webway travel that the shadow caused, even through the insulated corridors of the labyrinth dimension, meant that the bulk of the reinforcements simply could not arrive in time. Iyanden would face Kraken mostly alone. When the Tyranid fleet reached Iyanden's position, the battle began with the Void War, and at first it went better than anyone had expected. Iyanden's Admiral Ethrel was a tactical genius, and the Aeldari spacecraft were faster and more maneuverable than the Tyranid bioships, with weapons of longer range. Wave after wave of bioships were destroyed. For a brief, hopeful moment, it seemed as if the Aeldari fleet might hold. Then Kraken sent the rest of its forces. 2 waves struck almost simultaneously, each one larger than anything Ethrel had faced before. The Aeldari fleet was swept aside. Bioships reached Iyanden. The boarding assault began. What followed was the near death of a civilization. Mycetic spores, the Tyranids' insertion vehicles, living drop pods, rained from above. The craft world's surface, normally serene and carefully tended, became a battlefield. Tyranid warriors and Genestealers and Hormagaunts poured through every breach in the outer hull. Carnifexes, those 4-meter-tall biological tanks, tore through corridors that had stood for thousands of years. The ancient forests of silence, those carefully preserved woodlands grown within the craft world's pressurized interior, were reduced to splinters and carnage. And Farseer Kelman made the terrible decision that would change Iyanden forever. He ordered the Wraithguard to be awoken. To understand why this was a terrible decision, even though it was the right one, you need to understand what it means to call up the dead to fight. The souls stored in Iyanden's infinity circuit are not sleeping indefinitely by choice. They are waiting, preserved, in the hope that they will eventually be able to rest properly. That when Inayad, the god of the dead, awakens fully at the end of the Aeldari cycle, they will find the peace they cannot find in the warp while Slaanesh hungers for them. Calling them up to animate wraith bodies and fight once more is a mercy and a cruelty in equal measure. It asks the dead to become soldiers again. It asks what might be the final memory of a person to be spent in violence. Kelman knew this. He did it anyway, because Iyanden was dying. The Wraithguard fought with the fury of the long dead called back to defend everything they had ever loved. Wraith Lords, larger constructs housing the souls of particularly powerful or willing warriors, strode through Tyranid swarms, dealing devastation with psychic cannon and eldritch blade. The avatar of Cain, the shard of the elder god of war that every craft world keeps locked in its shrine until called upon in the direst need, was awakened. The molten giant emerged from its shrine and entered the battle, and its presence elevated every living fighter around it into a state of war frenzy that transcended normal fear. None of it was enough. The Tyranids had numbers that eclipsed anything the Wraithguard could handle. Kelman fell. Other Farseers fell. And still the swarm came. The craft world was being eaten, not just its defenders, being eaten. Ripper swarms moved through the parts of Iyanden that the main fighting had already swept through, dissolving every organic material they could find into raw nutrients that would feed the bioships waiting in orbit. The living floors of the craft world, the bio-organic materials that Aeldari construction relies on, were consumed. The trees of the forests of silence were reduced to nothing, and most terrifyingly, spirit stones, those small gems containing the souls of the dead, tucked into alcoves and displays throughout the craft world, were being shattered, not removed. Shattered. When a spirit stone is destroyed, the soul inside it does not go to the infinity circuit or to peace. It goes to Slaanesh. It is devoured by the Dark Prince, consumed in an instant of terrible ecstasy, gone forever. Iyanden's dead were being eaten twice, once by the Tyranids who destroyed their physical vessels, and once by the god who waited behind reality to claim what emerged. It was into this catastrophe that Prince Iriel of the Eldritch Raiders arrived. Iriel was, by the time of the battle, an exile. He had been banished from Iyanden years earlier for a combination of arrogance, disobedience, and the kind of spectacular recklessness that makes brilliant commanders either legends or disasters. He had his own fleet. He had been watching the galaxy from a distance, and when news of Iyanden's fall reached him, he came back. His fleet carved through the Tyranid blockade with the ferocity of someone who had something deeply personal to prove. He joined the ground battle personally, wielding the Spear of Twilight, a weapon of extraordinary power that also, in the manner of most dramatically useful weapons in the 40k setting, was slowly killing him. In the climactic confrontation, Iriel drove the Spear of Twilight through the head of the Hive tyrant coordinating the assault, severing the local synaptic connection and sending the Tyranids into the feral chaos that follows the death of their directing intelligence. Iyanden survived. Barely. 4/5 of its population was dead.
You know, what gets me about this whole situation is that the Webway was supposed to be the one place in the entire setting that felt safe. The Eldar built it over millions of years as a refuge from the very things that destroyed their civilization. It was their answer to a dying galaxy, and the Tyranids just walked in it anyway. That's what makes this lore hit different for me. It's not about the scale of the casualties or the size of the fleets. It's the implication, because if the Tyranids can find a way into a dimension that isn't even supposed to exist from their perspective, If they can adapt to something that old, that alien, that fundamentally outside their food chain, then I don't think there's a single corner of the setting that's actually off limits to them anymore. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
Both the living and an enormous portion of the preserved dead whose spirit stones had been destroyed. Its majestic fleet was a shadow of what it had been. Its beautiful interior was in ruins, and the Infinity Circuit, that living repository of Aeldari souls, had been damaged in ways that would take generations to repair, if they ever were. It was the worst defeat any craft world had ever suffered in the Tyrannic Wars, and it was also, as the Aeldari would soon discover, not over, because the hive mind had learned something from Iyanden, from the elder it had consumed, from the spirit stones it had broken, from the psychic architecture of the craft world it had partially devoured. The hive mind had received data, and data, for the Tyranids, is the first step toward adaptation. But there was a more immediate threat developing in the wake of Iyanden's survival. The survivors of Hive Fleet Kraken had been scattered but not destroyed, and the remnants were heading somewhere that should have been impossible to reach. Section 6. The unthinkable happens. Tyranids enter the Webway in the aftermath of the Battle of Iyanden. The surviving Aeldari Farseers worked quickly to close the door behind the retreating Tyranids. They summoned a warp storm, a deliberately cultivated psychic tempest in the Imperium, to block the route the Kraken remnants were using to pull back and regroup. The intent was to trap the surviving bioships in the storm and destroy them. For a time, it appeared to have worked. It had not. The bioships trapped in the warp storm did not die. The warp storm, as it turned out, displaced them rather than destroying them. Hundreds of Kraken bioships were ejected from the warp storm and deposited back into real space, battered, damaged, but alive. And the hive mind, which had been quietly processing everything it had absorbed from the Battle of Iyanden, including the genetic and psychic information of every Aeldari it had consumed, had a new understanding of what was possible. Farseer Taik Silvereye, who had survived the Battle of Iyanden and taken over leadership of the craft world's strategic response, began receiving visions. The Farseers of Iyanden, working through the psychic architecture that remained functioning in the damaged Infinity Circuit, followed the threads of possibility and found something deeply alarming. The remnants of Hive Fleet Kraken were not just reassembling, they were converging on a specific point, and the point they were converging on was the world of Duriel. Duriel was not particularly important by Aeldari standards. It was a world that contained a significant Webway nexus, a major junction point in the labyrinth dimension, connected to multiple routes through the Webway, including, crucially, routes leading to Iyanden itself and to other Aeldari territories. But the Farseers had a more immediate concern. The Kraken remnants were heading toward Duriel in conjunction with the forward tendrils of Hive Fleet Leviathan. Leviathan, remember, was the third and largest Tyranid incursion into the galaxy, even now pressing in from below the galactic plane. If the remnants of Kraken could merge with the forward elements of Leviathan, the result would be catastrophic. Kraken had consumed enormous amounts of Eldar biological and psychic data. Leviathan was already the most powerful and adaptive hive fleet in the galaxy. The fusion of Kraken's Eldar-derived knowledge with Leviathan's resources would produce something the Aeldari believed could not be stopped by any force currently available. A Tyranid strain specifically enhanced for fighting the Aeldari, with the psychic sophistication of the most ancient and powerful psychic species in the galaxy encoded in its genetics. The only way to prevent this was to destroy Duriel, all of it, before the fleets could merge. The Harlequins, those strange and inscrutable servants of the Laughing God, who walk the Webway as their permanent home, brokered what should have been an impossible alliance. The craft world Eldar of Iyanden and Bieltan, the Drukari of Komorach, who had their own reasons, very practical, very self-interested reasons, for not wanting the Webway to become infested with Tyranids, the Harlequins themselves. The plan was elegant and brutal in the way that Aeldari plans often are. The Drukari provided the weapon, a device called the Fireheart, a psychic bomb of tremendous power that would destroy the core of Duriel and take the planet apart from the inside. The Aeldari coalition would fight to defend the Fireheart long enough for someone to activate it. The someone who activated it would not survive. But before that plan could play out, something happened that no one had predicted. Something that changed everything. The Webway nexus on Duriel was compromised, not breached from the inside, not attacked from real space through a conventional assault on the planet's surface. The Tyranid vanguard, moving ahead of the main fleet, had found a way into the Webway through the nexus point. And through that nexus point, swarms of Tyranid organisms began to pour into the labyrinth dimension. For the Aeldari, this was not simply a military crisis. It was something close to a spiritual horror. The Webway was sanctuary. It was the one place in the galaxy that was, theoretically, safe from the worst of what the galaxy's various catastrophes could do to them. It was home. It was protected. The Tyranids had gotten inside their home. Farthest Silvereye received the report from Iyanden's vanguard, with the news that the Duriel Webway nexus was compromised even before the bulk of Iyanden's forces had reached Duriel. The Tyranids were not just on the planet. They were in the tunnels. They were moving through the Webway toward Iyanden's own Webway gate. What Silvereye did next defined the rest of the battle. He ordered Iyanden's ghost warriors, the wraith constructs animated by the souls of the dead, to form a wall in front of the Craftworld's Webway gate. A literal wall. Wraithbone forms packed shoulder to shoulder in the glowing corridors of the labyrinth dimension, sun cannons and de-scythed ready, the dead of Iyanden standing between the living and the great devourer. Inside the Webway, the Tyranids encountered terrain entirely unlike anything in real space. In real space, Tyranid organisms are extraordinarily well-adapted predators. They can climb any surface, breathe any atmosphere, tolerate any temperature gradient, and find and consume biomass in almost any environment. They have been to the hardest of vacuum-exposed void, and to the crushed depths of ocean worlds, and to the irradiated surfaces of worlds orbiting unstable stars. They are, in biological terms, the most comprehensively adaptable multicellular organisms ever encountered. But the Webway was something their biology had never encountered. The geometry was wrong. Gravity worked in multiple directions simultaneously, or not at all. The light came from nowhere and everywhere. Distances contracted and expanded without warning, and the psychic saturation of the environment, those old ones constructed materials, radiating a faint but constant psychic field, was something that Tyranid organisms, which lack the kind of psychic sensitivity that would help them perceive it consciously, nonetheless felt in their biology in ways that were profoundly disorienting. And the walls were alive, in a sense. The wraithbone that formed the Webway structure was semi-organic, responsive to psychic influence. In the presence of the Hive, mind's psychic overflow, the shadow in the warp, pressing against the walls from outside, while the Tyranid organisms pressed against them from within, the wraithbone began to behave in ways that had never been recorded. Some sections began to crack. Others became strangely flexible, bending rather than shattering. The psychic wards, built into the Webway's structure, designed to keep the warp out, were being stressed in entirely the wrong direction. And inside these strange corridors, the ghost warriors waited. Imagine fighting in a dimension where you cannot be certain which way is forward, where the enemy you are facing has no concept of retreat, no capacity for fear, and is being directed by an intelligence so vast and so utterly alien that it processes tactical information at a scale that would make a Space Marine's enhanced brain seem like a child's counting frame, where the enemy, even as it is being destroyed, is feeding biological data back to the Hive mind, refining its understanding of the environment, constantly producing new organisms specifically adapted to whatever you just did to the last wave. The ghost warriors held, barely, the sun cannons carved through Tyranid flesh that was already beginning to adapt to the light conditions of the Webway. The D-scythes, weapons that unmade organic matter at the most fundamental level, were effective in ways that conventional weapons were not, because the Tyranids had not developed resistance to them yet. The narrow corridors worked in the defenders' favour. The Tyranids could not bring their numbers to bear all at once. Then the avatar of Kine came. Iyanden's avatar, that molten, screaming embodiment of the Eldar god of war, called from its shrine for the second time in this same conflict, walked into the Webway corridors, and everything changed. The presence of a divine entity in the labyrinth dimension was something the Wraithbones seemed to respond to. The psychic field strengthened, the walls held more firmly, and the Tyranids, who had been pressing steadily forward, met something they could not simply absorb and adapt to. Something that moved like violence given a body, that burned with psychic fire, that dealt damage on both the material and psychic planes simultaneously. The Tyranids inside the Webway stalled. Iyanden's forces pushed them back. And eventually, step by step, with the Ghost Warriors and the Avatar driving them, the Tyranid swarm was pushed back through the compromised nexus and onto the surface of Duriel, where the wider battle was still being fought. The Fireheart was activated. The planet imploded. The energy release was sufficient to destroy both the Nexus and the Tyranid forces that had been using it. Prince Uriel led the fleet assault against the bioships in orbit alongside Drukhari attack craft, finishing off the remnants and denying the fusion of Kraken and Leviathan. Farseer Tech Silvereye died on Duriel's surface, guiding the last of the Wraithguard as they held the line long enough for the living to escape. His soul went into the Infinity Circuit, as Aeldari souls are meant to, joining the ancestors he had led to battle one final time. The Webway had been breached, it had been held, and the galaxy had learned something new and terrible about what the Tyranids were capable of. Section 7, what they found inside, the nature of the labyrinth. Let us slow down here, because I want to really think about what the Tyranids actually encountered when they entered the Webway at Duriel, because the physical and metaphysical reality of the place they entered is deeply significant. When the hive mind first pushed organisms through the compromised nexus, what it encountered was not what it had expected, or rather, more accurately, the hive mind encountered something its previous experience had not prepared it for, because no Tyranid organism had ever entered a constructed extra-dimensional space before. The Webway's interior, even in the relatively unused sections near the Duriel nexus, bore evidence of its enormous age and its incredibly complicated history. Ancient Aeldari script ran along the walls in places, not decoration, but functional. The script was a kind of ongoing diagnostic record, millennia of accumulated notation by Aeldari engineers and bone singers about the condition of various sections of the tunnel, notes about where the wards had been reinforced, where cracks had been repaired, where dangerous, warp-contaminated sections had been sealed off. The Tyranids that first entered this space passed through corridors where history itself was literally inscribed on the walls. They also encountered something that no Tyranid organism had ever encountered before in its brief biological existence: silence. Not the silence of an airless void, which Tyranid organisms navigate without difficulty because they do not require atmosphere to function tactically. This was psychic silence. The shadow in the warp, which the hive mind uses to saturate every environment it operates in, and which normally provides Tyranid organisms with a constant subliminal background hum of synaptic connectivity, was partially attenuated inside the Webway. The psychic-resistant materials that formed the walls did not block the shadow completely, but they muffled it. They reduced it to something quieter than the hive mind expected. For individual Tyranid organisms, this produced an unusual effect. Without the full intensity of the shadow, the most basic synapse connections became slightly less efficient. Organisms that normally moved with the perfect coordination of limbs of a single body found themselves operating with fractionally less cohesion. Not enough to make them ineffective, they remained terrifyingly capable, but enough that careful Aeldari defenders noticed a slight lag in the Tyranids' usual perfect formation behavior in the Webway sections. They were still being directed by the hive mind, still coordinated, still deadly, but the dimension they were in was not cooperating with their command infrastructure the way that real space did. The Tyranids also encountered the ruins. The Webway is full of them. In the tens of thousands of years since the fall, enormous stretches of the network have been abandoned. Sections that were once lively transit corridors connecting major Aeldari population centers now stand empty, their walls still intact, their bioluminescent features still faintly active, but their gates sealed and their contents complicated. Some of these abandoned sections contain the remains of the port cities that once punctuated the Webway like oases. Pre-fall, Aeldari cities within the Webway dimension, built with the kind of extravagant grandeur that the height of the Aeldari Empire could afford. Soaring wraithbone spires, gardens tended by psychically constructed servitor analogues, living artwork that expressed emotions and stories in dimensions of perception that most races cannot even process. The Tyranids that entered these sections encountered an entirely alien kind of environment. The cities were not just architecturally strange, they were psychically dense in a way that real space environments simply were not. Every wall, every surface, every structure in a pre-fall Aeldari city was built from wraithbone or its derivatives, material that holds psychic charge the way iron holds magnetic charge. A building standing undisturbed for 30,000 years, holding the emotional residue of the civilization that built it, the joy and the grief and the celebration and the tragedy of tens of thousands of years of Aeldari life, is not simply a structure, it is a recording. The hive mind, through the organisms it directed through these spaces, received something it had never received before. Unstructured psychic data, not the clean genetic information it typically absorbs when it processes the biological material of consumed organisms, not the tactical data fed back by organisms observing enemy forces. Something rawer and stranger, something that was, in a very loose and probably inadequate analogy, more like memory than information. Whether the hive mind could process this or understood what it was receiving is genuinely unclear. The Tyranids do not process emotional content the way that most sentient species do. The hive mind's intelligence is vast but not human-shaped, not Aeldari-shaped, not shaped by any familiar model of consciousness. When it absorbed the psychic residue of pre-fall Aeldari civilization from the walls of those ancient cities, it received data that had no category in its processing framework. What it did with that data is one of the most intriguing open questions in the entire setting. There is also the matter of the Webway's other tenants. The Webway is not populated solely by Aeldari. Over the millennia, various creatures and entities have established themselves in its more remote and less patrolled sections. Some of these are relatively benign, or at least non-hostile, anomalies, creatures that drifted in through damaged sections and found the environment hospitable. Others are considerably less pleasant. The Psych-Nuin are wasp-like psychic predators that nest in damaged sections of the Webway, particularly in areas where the wall between the labyrinth dimension and the warp has been weakened. They are dangerous to psychers, capable of implanting larvae in their brains that consume the host's consciousness from the inside. The Aeldari hunt them regularly and seal the sections where they breed. But the Webway is large, and the Psych-Nuin are persistent. When the Tyranids entered the Webway and began moving through its corridors, the Psych-Nuin did not run. This is either a statement of their territorial aggression or evidence of a profound underestimation of what they were dealing with. They attacked the Tyranid organisms and discovered, presumably to whatever psychic analogue of surprise they possessed, that the organisms had nothing recognizable as a mind to implant their larvae into. Tyranid organisms' consciousness exists not in individual brains in any conventional sense, but distributed across the synaptic network of the entire swarm. The Psych-Nuin's specialized biology for psychic predation had no foothold in the Tyranid nervous system. Their larvae dissolved without effect. The Tyranids, for their part, added the Psych-Nuin to the hive mind's genetic catalogue and ate them. And then there are the things sealed behind the Webway's runic wards, the parts of the network that even the Aeldari do not enter, not because they have forgotten the roots, but because they very specifically remember what is in there and do not want to encounter it. Demon-infested sections, places where the warp breach was never fully repaired after the fall, and where entities of the Imperium have established themselves in the Webway's structure. Anomalous zones where physics behaves in ways that defy prediction. Some of the sealed sections contain things that have no name in any known lexicon, things that drifted into the Webway in the aftermath of the war in heaven, when the Old One's great civilizational experiments were running out of control, and the barriers between dimensions were at their most unstable. Things that have been sealed for 60 million years or more. Whether the Tyranids, in their brief and violently contested incursion, reached any of these sections, we do not know. The Aeldari, who survived the Battle of Duriel, and who subsequently mapped the damage to the Duriel nexus, were not able to determine how deep into the network the Tyranid incursion had penetrated before it was driven back. Some of the inner corridors showed evidence of Tyranid biological residue in places that surprised even the Farseers doing the assessment. What we do know is that the Hive mind received data from every organism it had deployed inside the Webway, right up to the moment those organisms were destroyed. Every surface touched, every anomaly perceived, every creature encountered, every ancient artifact or psychic resonance or geometric impossibility that a Tyranid eye or sensory organ had observed went back into the Hive mind, and the Hive mind never forgets. Section 8. The Eldar Response. Wraithbone, Avatars, and Desperate Alliances. The Aeldari response to the Tyranid breach of the Webway at Duriel was not simply military, it was civilizational. To understand the weight of what the alliance that fought at Duriel represented, you need to understand how fractured the Aeldari people had become by the 41st millennium. The broad strokes. The fall split the Aeldari into several distinct and often hostile groups. The Craftworld Aeldari, the Asuryani, drifted the stars in their vast Craftworld vessels, dedicated to rigid paths of emotional discipline designed to keep Slaanesh from claiming their souls. The Drukhari, the Dark Eldar, had retreated into the Webway and chosen a different approach, feeding on the pain and suffering of others to sustain their own souls, staying vibrant enough that Slaanesh could not take them quietly, maintaining their immortality through constant cruelty. The Harlequins walked between all groups, serving the laughing god Segarak, carrying the history of the Aeldari people in performance and keeping the secrets of the Black Library. The Exodites lived on their verdant maiden worlds at the galaxy's edges, living simply and connected to their world spirits. These groups, by the 41st millennium, were not allies by default. The Drukhari and the Craftworld Aeldari despised each other, the former seeing the latter as naively self-defeating, the latter seeing the former as irredeemably monstrous. Interactions between them ranged from tense to violent. The Harlequins maintained neutrality through sheer reputation and the authority of their god. And yet at Duriel, all three major groups came together to fight the Tyranids. The Craftworld forces of Iyanden and Bieltan formed the backbone of the alliance. Iyanden's contribution was particularly striking given how badly the Craftworld had been damaged at the Battle of Iyanden. They were fighting with reserves they barely had, calling up dead warriors they had already called up once in the same war. Bieltan, the Craftworld of the Swordwind, brought its legendary aspect warriors, those specialists in the paths of war who trained under the direct lineages of the Phoenix Lords, the near-divine eternal warriors of the Aeldari. Bieltan's forces arrived at Duriel first and bore the worst of the early fighting, as the Swordwind's culture of aggressive, stylized warfare met the Tyranid swarms at full force. The Drukhari's involvement was brokered by the Harlequins, and it was pragmatic on all sides. Commorragh existed inside the Webway. If the Tyranids fully breached the Webway and began moving through it without constraint, Commorragh was not safe. The Drukhari had enormous resources, access through the Webway, and absolutely no desire to see their city of stolen sons consumed by the Great Devourer. Their contribution to the Alliance came in two forms. First, the provision of the Fireheart weapon, which the Homunculi had either constructed or rediscovered from some dark corner of their medical sadistic research, and second, the deployment of raiding forces through the Webway to support the ground battle. The Drukhari fighters, The Kabbalite warriors, the witches, the scourges, the incubi, fought in a style utterly unlike their craft-world cousins. Where the Asuryani aspect warriors were disciplined, technically precise, devoted to particular fighting philosophies that elevated combat to something close to sacred art, the Drukhari fought with the anarchic ferocity of people who had been surviving in the most dangerous city in the galaxy for 10,000 years. They were fast, cruel, and entirely unafraid in ways that even the craft world Aeldari sometimes found unsettling. Watching the two groups fight side by side, theoretically in pursuit of the same objective, must have been deeply strange. An aspect warrior of the dire Avengers, disciplined and spiritually focused, advancing in precise formation beside a Kabbalite warrior who was simultaneously fighting Tyranids and making side assessments of which surviving Aeldari civilians might make decent slaves for the arenas of Komorrach. The Harlequins were the connective tissue. Their ability to move through the Webway's more treacherous sections gave them tactical mobility that no other group could match. They could appear in parts of the battlefield that seemed unreachable, carry messages and orders between separated forces, and vanish again before the enemy could respond. More than that, their presence had a subtle stabilizing effect on the alliance itself. When the craft world Aeldari and Drukhari were about to turn on each other in the middle of the battle, which given their history was a genuine possibility, a Harlequin patrol would materialize nearby, with the Shadowseer's inscrutable attention making it very clear that the Laughing God was watching and that certain behaviors would be remembered. The avatar of Kane's deployment in the Webway itself deserves special attention. The avatar, in Aeldari theology, is a shard of the god of war, made temporarily manifest through a sacrifice, the young king, an exarch who gives themselves to the avatar's awakening during the ritual. The resulting entity is not quite a god, but is certainly not simply a biological organism. It is something in between, a divine presence wearing flesh, an expression of divine fury given temporary form in the material world. When this entity entered the Webway, it was moving into a dimension that the Aeldari themselves describe as semi-divine, the Old One's greatest construction, imbued with the psychic resonance of their civilization and insulated from the warp by the most advanced barriers they knew how to build. The interaction between the Avatar's divine nature and the Webway's psychic architecture was something that even the Farseers observing it had difficulty articulating afterward. The Tyranids' response to the Avatar was one of the most significant moments in the battle. The Hive mind, through its organisms, recognized the Avatar as a threat unlike anything it had catalogued before. Not a psyker, the Avatar's power did not come from the warp in the conventional sense. Not a technological system that could be physically destroyed in the straightforward way. Something that occupied a category the Hive mind's threat assessment framework did not have a ready entry for. The Tyranid swarms did not panic. They are incapable of panic as individual organisms. But the Hive mind redirected resources, pulled organisms from other sections of the Webway incursion to respond to this new priority, and in doing so created gaps in its coverage that Take Silver-Eye's ghost warriors exploited with precision. The Avatar did not defeat the Tyranids in the Webway alone. It complicated the Hive mind's calculations just enough, for just long enough, to give the defenders the window they needed. The alliance held. Duriel was destroyed. The fusion of Kraken and Leviathan was prevented, but the Aeldari knew that preventing this particular disaster did not mean the threat was over. The Hive mind had been inside the Webway. It had received data about the Webway's interior, and it had survived to process that data and incorporate it into its species-wide understanding of the galaxy it was consuming. Section 9. The Genetic Legacy. What the Tyranids took. The Tyranids do not simply fight wars, they perform biological assessments. Every organism that the Hive mind deploys is, in a sense, a collection device. Every sensory organ, every adaptive biological structure, every interaction with a new environment or new species feeds information back to the Hive mind through the synaptic network. And when an organism is recovered, or when enough of its genetic material is available in the biomass pool, the Norn Queens process that information and use it to produce new, more specifically adapted variants for future conflicts. The question of what the Tyranids took from their encounters in and around the Webway is therefore a deeply serious one, because the answer has implications not just for the Aeldari, but for every species in the galaxy. Let us start with what is confirmed. Following the Battle of Iyanden, the Hive Fleet Kraken's assault on the craft world, Codex Tyranids has explicitly noted that the hive mind's assimilation of Aeldari DNA. Following this battle appears to have improved the zoanthrope strain. The zoanthrope, recall, is already believed to have been at least partly derived from ancient Eldar genetic material. Those floating, atrophied horrors with their oversized craniums and their psychic power that rivals the Aeldari's own. After Iyanden, after thousands of Aeldari warriors and civilians and their genetic material had been processed through the Tyranid consumption cycle, the zoanthropes became notably more powerful. The specific mechanisms are not fully understood by the Imperium's xenobiologists. They know the outcome more than the process, but the correlation is clear. Consume Aeldari genetics at scale, produce enhanced psychic bioforms. The hive mind had found a way to improve its most powerful psychic weapon by feeding it the material of the galaxy's most psychic species. This matters enormously for the Webway story. The Aeldari's psychic mastery is not simply a cultural or technical skill. It is encoded in their biology at the deepest level. Their brains are physically different from human brains, differently structured, differently organized, with neural pathways that interact with the warp in ways that human neurology does not replicate. When the Tyranids absorb this biological material and incorporate it into zoanthrope genetics, they are incorporating a design principle for psychic sensitivity that is millions of years more refined than anything else in the galaxy. The implication is that every battle the Tyranids fight against the Aeldari makes them better at psychic warfare. Every craft world that falls, every exodite world consumed, every force of Aeldari warriors that dies in combat and whose bodies are swept into the biomass pool, feeds the hive mind's growing library of psychic genetic solutions. The Aeldari are, in a horrible sense, teaching the Great Devourer to do what they do best. And the Webway incursion added a dimension to this that goes beyond simple genetic absorption. Inside the Webway, the Tyranid organisms moved through an environment saturated with psychic resonance in ways that no real space environment is. The Webway's walls hold psychic charge accumulated over millions of years. The ruins of pre-fall Aeldari cities, sitting in abandoned sections of the network, contain the psychic residue of a civilization that was, at its height, possibly the most psychically sophisticated culture in the history of the galaxy. The hive mind, through the organisms that moved through those spaces, received something that cannot be cleanly categorized as genetic information or tactical data. It received psychic architecture. It received the shapes of how the Aeldari built things in dimensions that exist between dimensions. It received, in some form, the principles by which the Webway itself functions. Whether this data was comprehensible to the hive mind in any form it could use is a question that the Aeldari's best farseers have been arguing about ever since the Duriel incident. Some hold that the hive mind's intelligence, however vast, simply does not have the processing framework to extract meaning from psychic architecture, that it received the data the way a person with no musical training might experience a symphony, as sensation without structure. Others are less sanguine. There are farseers who believe that the hive mind, over sufficient time, can find patterns in any data it receives, and that the data from the Webway incursion will eventually be metabolized into something the Tyranids can apply. The most concerning version of this theory is that the hive mind has received, at least partial, navigational data about the Webway's structure. The Tyranid organisms inside the Nexus at Duriel did not simply move in a single corridor and then get pushed back. They spread. They went in multiple directions, as Tyranid organisms typically do, because distributed exploration is how the hive mind maps new territory. The corridors they moved through, the junction points they reached, the directions they continued in before being engaged by defenders, All of that mapped a portion of the Webway's local structure. The Webway's navigational secrecy is one of its primary defenses. The Aeldari's advantage in using it comes partly from the simple fact that no one else knows where the corridors go. The entrances are hidden. The routes are not recorded in any medium that outsiders can access. The Harlequins are perhaps the only beings in the galaxy with a comprehensive mental map of the current network. If the Hive mind has begun to acquire sections of that map, even small and fragmented sections, the implications are serious. There is also the matter of the Drukhari. When the Dark Eldar joined the Alliance at Duriel, they moved through the Webway to reach the battleground. Kabbalite raiding parties, witch cult fighters, homunculi, and their flesh-crafted servants, all of these forces traveled through Webway routes that normally connect Komorrah to the wider galaxy. In the chaos of a contested Webway nexus, with Tyranid organisms moving through corridors adjacent to the routes the Drukhari were using, it is not impossible that some organisms caught enough directional data about the Drukhari's approach vectors to give the hive mind the beginning of a thread to pull. Komorrah, the greatest city in the galaxy, exists inside the Webway. It has millions of inhabitants. It contains an enormous concentration of organic biomass, Aeldari biomass specifically, and the biomass of every slave species the Drukhari have brought to their city from across the galaxy. If the Tyranids ever found their way into the Webway routes leading to Komorrah's satellite realms, the consequences would be difficult to overstate. But that is an escalation the timeline has not reached yet. What the Tyranids definitively took from their Webway incursion, at minimum, is this: proof of concept. The labyrinth dimension can be breached. The psychic wards can be stressed to failure under sufficient biological pressure on the right kind of node point. The shadow in the warp can partially penetrate the Webway's insulation when Tyranid organisms are inside it simultaneously, creating a dual pressure effect that damages the dimensional integrity in ways that purely external attack cannot achieve. And the entities inside the Webway, the ancient constructions, the Drukhari city, the Black Library hidden somewhere in its most secret depths, are accessible in principle. The hive mind knows this now. The question is what it will do with the knowledge. Section 10. Hive Fleet Kronos and the Webway's future. In the era Indomitus, after the opening of the Great Rift, after the Cicatrix Maledictum tore a ragged wound across the galaxy and began flooding the material universe with warp energy at an unprecedented rate, the Tyranids faced a new problem. The raw matter of chaos offers no nourishment to Tyranids. This is a fundamental biochemical incompatibility. The warp substance, that psychic energy imbued reality fluid from which demons are made and chaos corruption spreads, cannot be metabolized by Tyranid biology. It provides no amino acids, no lipids, no genetic material that the Norn Queens can incorporate into their designs. It is, to a Tyranid organism, essentially inedible, the equivalent of offering a biological system made of flesh and chemistry, a plate of mathematics. And now the Great Rift was spreading warp contamination across systems that the Hive fleets had been looking forward to consuming. Worlds that should have been lush with biomass were becoming chaos-tainted and useless. The hive mind was facing the prospect of vast stretches of the galaxy becoming nutritionally worthless. The hive mind's response was Hive Fleet Kronos. Kronos is, by many measures, the most interesting hive fleet in the game's history, partly because it is so completely unlike any other Tyranid force. It is specifically adapted to fight chaos. Its shadow in the warp is so amplified, so powerfully focused, that it does not merely interfere with warp communications and psyker ability, it actively suppresses warp rifts. When the concentrated psychic null power of Kronos focuses on a warp rift, the rift closes. The immaterium energy flowing through it is suppressed, the dimensional tear is sealed, and the world is no longer tainted. This is, in the context of a Tyranid fleet, extraordinary. It is the biological equivalent of developing a digestive enzyme specifically to neutralize a type of poison, except the poison is a god. The hive mind has engineered a hive fleet to act as a cleanup crew for chaos corruption, restoring the viability of worlds it wants to eat later. What does this have to do with the Webway? The Webway, post-Great Rift, is in worse shape than it has been since the fall of the Aeldari. The Cicatrix Maledictum's birth sent shockwaves through every dimension connected to the warp, and while the Webway's walls are more resistant to warp contamination than real space, they are not invulnerable. Sections of the network that were already damaged by the fall have been further destabilized. New breaches have appeared. The Drukhari have been working overtime to seal damaged corridors in and around Komorach, and even they, who have more tactical interest in Webway maintenance than anyone alive, cannot keep up with the rate of deterioration. Into this damaged, increasingly compromised network, an adversary that has already demonstrated it can breach Webway nexus points adds a layer of threat that the Aeldari cannot ignore. But here is the thing about Kronos that changes the calculus in a way that no strategist in the galaxy expected. When Kronos operates along the Great Rift, sealing warp rifts and purging chaos corruption, it is, inadvertently, helping the Aeldari by destroying their most persistent enemies. There are records of Craftworld Aeldari forces watching Kronos annihilate a chaos warband they had been fighting for months and simply standing aside, not joining the battle, not helping, just watching the Tyranids do what they were going to do anyway, and recognizing that in this particular case, the galaxy's most voracious predator was hunting prey that the Aeldari also wanted dead. This is not cooperation. The Aeldari are not deluded enough to think that Kronos views them as anything other than food, but it is a recognition of situational complexity that the Tyranids, in their pure hunger incarnation, would not have shown earlier in their arrival in the galaxy. The hive mind is not acting in the galaxy's interest, it is acting in the hive mind's interest, which in this specific context produces outcomes that, from certain angles, superficially resemble acting in the galaxy's interest. For the Webway, Kronos' operations along the Great Rift have a secondary effect. The same shadow in the warp that is powerful enough to close warp rifts is also powerful enough to stress the Webway's walls from the outside in ways that earlier Hive fleets could not. If a Kronos tendril were ever to operate in close proximity to a major Webway junction, the dual pressure effect that was briefly observed at Duriel could be replicated at scale. Shadow pressing from outside, while Tyranid organisms press from inside, cracking a dimensional wall that should be impenetrable. No documented Kronos assault on Webway infrastructure has occurred as of the current timeline's endpoint, but the capability exists. The hive mind has the proof of concept, the genetic blueprint for organisms that can operate inside the Webway, and now a hive fleet specifically engineered for the most powerful, psychic, null field application in the history of the Tyranid species. The question of whether the hive mind has yet made the connection between all these capabilities and decided to use them in combination is one that keeps certain Farseers awake through very long nights. Section 11. The deeper horror. What could come? Let us spend a few moments thinking through what the worst-case scenario actually looks like. Because in Warhammer 40k, the worst case is always worth mapping. The Webway, as we have established, contains two things of incalculable strategic importance: Komorach and the Black Library. Komorach first. The Drukhari city contains millions of inhabitants, a massive and diverse population of Dark Eldar, along with slaves from dozens of species. In terms of raw biomass, it is an extraordinarily rich target. But more than biomass, it contains, in the Homunculi covens, some of the most sophisticated biological expertise in the galaxy. The Homunculi have been studying, experimenting on, and rebuilding organic matter for 10,000 years. Their medical knowledge, if it can be called medical when its primary application is creative torture, is unparalleled. The Homunculi of Urian Rakarth once abducted an entire planet while it was still infested with Tyranids, specifically to study the Great Devourer up close at their leisure. If the Tyranids ever reached the corridors of Komorach, they would not simply be consuming biomass, they would be consuming the Homunculi themselves, entities whose biological knowledge, if absorbed, could give the hive mind access to techniques of genetic engineering that it has never encountered before. The Tyranids already adapt at an extraordinary rate. The question is what they would do with the homunculi's knowledge layered on top of that capability. And then there is the Black Library. The Black Library is, in the cosmology of Warhammer 40k, one of the most significant locations in the entire universe. It is the repository of everything the Aeldari have ever learned about chaos, about the chaos gods themselves, about the nature of the warp, about every technique and strategy and weapon and defense and countermeasure that the long history of the Aeldari's survival has produced. It contains information about the Old Ones, about the war in heaven, about things that happened before the races now populating the galaxy had evolved. The Chaos Gods themselves want access to the Black Library. They have sent demons and possessed servants and Chaos Champions through the Webway for 10,000 years in various attempts to find it, and the Harlequins have spent 10,000 years hunting all of these attempts down and ending them with finality. The Black Library is the most zealously guarded secret in the galaxy. Now imagine the hive mind absorbing it. Not reading it. The hive mind does not read, does not process information the way a scholar does. But when Tyranid organisms consume organic matter, they receive genetic data. When they move through psychic environments, they receive psychic resonance data. The Black Library is constructed of wraithbone and psychoconductive materials. It has been exposed to the thoughts of every Aeldari scholar who has ever worked there, and to the contents of every document, data crystal, and living artwork that has ever been kept within it. It is, in a very real sense, saturated with the information it contains. This is speculative. This is the domain of theory and horror, and the kind of lore discussion that happens at 2 in the morning when you have had too much coffee, and the 40k setting has gotten under your skin in a particular way. There is no storyline, as of the current canon, in which the hive mind has accessed the Black Library, but the mechanism by which it could try is now established. The hive mind knows the Webway can be breached. It knows, from Duriel and from the ongoing operation of its organisms in the Eastern Fringe, that Webway nexus points represent the weakest structural points in the network. Hive Fleet Kronos has demonstrated the capacity to generate a shadow in the warp powerful enough to close warp rifts. The combination of Kronos-style external pressure on a Webway gate with an internal incursion force pushing from inside could potentially stress even the Black Library's defenses. The Harlequins know this. Their response has become even more aggressive in the era Indomitus, their hunting patrols through the Webway more frequent, their willingness to make contact with and manipulate other factions more pronounced. The Shadowseer who appeared to Prince Uriel at the end of the Battle of Valador and showed him visions of possible futures was not acting without purpose. The Harlequins are, in their own cryptic way, trying to steer the timeline away from certain very specific outcomes. Whether they will succeed is, like most things in Warhammer 40k, very much an open question. What is not an open question is this: the Tyranids have already found something in the Webway that no external force was supposed to find. They have found that it is possible to enter. They have found something of its interior. They have absorbed the psychic resonance of its most ancient sections. And they have walked away, in the specific sense that the hive mind continues to exist and think and adapt. With data about one of the most significant and secret dimensions in the galaxy, the Great Devourer's hunger does not end with the material universe. It reaches into the dimensions that exist between the stars and beneath reality, and the dimension that the Aeldari have depended on for their survival for 50,000 years is not as safe as it used to be. Section 12. The Silence After. There is a piece of Aeldari philosophy that the Harlequins sometimes enact in their performances, and it goes something like this: every story that has not ended is still happening. The Tyranids' breach of the Webway at Duriel was not a story that ended when the planet imploded. It was a story that began something. The hive mind received data. The Aeldari learned that their most sacred and protected dimension was vulnerable in a new way. The Drukhari, who have staked their entire civilization on the assumption that the Webway is ultimately safe, were given very specific cause to reconsider. The Harlequins began moving with new urgency through paths they had previously patrolled at leisure. Every adaptation the Tyranids make is permanent. When the hive mind figures out how to do something, it remembers. The biology that allowed the first Kraken organisms to survive and navigate in the Webway, however briefly, was catalogued. The understanding that Webway nexus points under sufficient Tyranid biological and psychic pressure can fail was catalogued. The dimensional data gathered by organisms moving through Webway corridors was catalogued. In the aftermath of the fall of the Aeldari, the galaxy's creatures spent 10,000 years learning to live with what had changed. They learned where the new boundaries were. They learned which dimensions were safe and which were ruined. They adjusted their strategic thinking accordingly. The Webway's survivability, post-fall, was one of those adjusted assumptions. It was damaged, yes, but it was a known quantity, a damaged thing with known weaknesses and known defenses. The Tyranids arriving in the galaxy are, in a sense, taking that assessment and running all the calculations again from scratch. Not because they chose to, not because they are making strategic decisions about which assumptions to challenge, but because the hive mind has no preconceptions. It does not inherit the galaxy's understanding of itself. It arrived from outside and perceives the galaxy's structures purely as collections of biomass to be consumed, psychic barriers to be overcome, and data to be processed. And in the complete absence of the civilizational assumption that the Webway is safe and should be treated as safe, the hive mind has found a way in that had never been found before. That is what makes the Tyranids uniquely terrifying among the galaxy's many terrors. Chaos has been trying to corrupt the Webway for 10,000 years and has made limited progress because the warp, despite its power, is blocked by the Webway's psychic insulation. The Necrons, who have access to a few dolmen gates, can enter limited sections of the Webway but not penetrate its deeper corridors. The Imperium has one damaged connection through the Golden Throne that has been in a state of emergency maintenance for 10 millennia. None of these forces, with all their power and knowledge and millennia of experience, found the angle that the Tyranids found. They found it because hunger, stripped of all other context, looks at every surface of a problem and finds the one approach that millennia of strategic thinking had ruled out as impossible or irrelevant. The Tyranids did not think their way into the Webway. They simply kept pressing, kept pushing, kept sending organisms through every available space and dimension and possibility until they found something that gave way. And now the galaxy knows it. The Aeldari know it. The Harlequins, who perhaps suspected it could happen but hoped it would not, know it with certainty now. Even the Drukhari, for all their arrogance about the inviolability of their city, had a moment of something rare and genuine when the Webway nexus at Duriel failed, had a moment of looking at the dark and understanding that the dark was looking back. The Webway was built to be the safest path through a dangerous universe. For most of its history, it was. The Tyranids have begun the long, patient, horrifying process of making it something else. Stay curious about the darkness, everyone. There is more of it than we thought. If you enjoyed this video, the like button is just below, and subscribing to the channel keeps these deep dives coming. You can also ring the notification bell so you do not miss future uploads. We go to some unusual places in the lore here on Q, on 40k, and there is a lot more to explore. I read every comment, so if there are topics you want covered, let me know down below. Until next time, rest well, dream quietly, and do not think too hard about how large the galaxy is and how much of it is hungry.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.